I am Vanessa, 32 years old, a tech entrepreneur who once lived on determination and ramen noodles. After years of sacrifice, I sold my startup and quietly purchased a $5 million estate in Vermont, a sanctuary none of my family knew existed. I had imagined revealing it to them at Thanksgiving, picturing their awe as they walked through the grand doors. Yet that plan unraveled with a single text from my mother. "This year, just your sister's family, keeping it small." My response was short, only one word: enjoy. But behind it lay decades of disappointment. Growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I was always the afterthought. Our modest 3-bedroom house displayed endless trophies and photographs of my sister Catherine, the homecoming queen and cheer captain, the daughter who seemed to shine without effort. My achievements never earned the same space. While she attended football games and dances, I was in my room, piecing together computers and writing code that nobody cared to understand. When I received my acceptance into Stanford's computer science program, my mother frowned at the distance and suggested I stay closer to home like Catherine. The same week, Catherine's boyfriend had marked 6 months with her, and that seemed to warrant it more excitement than my scholarship. This pattern deepened through the years. At Catherine's wedding, I wasn't asked to be a bridesmaid despite her large bridal party. At Thanksgiving dinners, she relaxed with the family while I worked in the kitchen. My early boyfriends were met with indifference while Catherine's husband Brad became the son my parents never had. Even after I began climbing the tech ladder, my father introduced me as our daughter, who is still figuring things out well into my late 20s. Catherine was the reliable daughter who gave them grandchildren, and I was the ambitious one who lived too far away. Family milestones often excluded me entirely. I learned about gatherings only after seeing photos on social media. When my grandmother fell ill, Catherine was called immediately while I found out days later. I rushed home only to stand on the margins while decisions were made without me. That constant dismissal became fuel. If my family refused to see my value, I would prove it to myself and the world. I poured myself into work, creating my own circle of support and letting go of the hope that my parents would ever understand. They never visited me in California, though they vacationed regularly with Catherine and her children. Over time, rejection turned into a strange freedom. I built my own traditions, surrounded myself with friends who valued me, and pursued my passions without apology. At Stanford, I worked 3 jobs to keep my scholarship afloat. Mornings began at 5:30 a.m. in the campus coffee shop, afternoons tutoring high schoolers, evenings at the university tech desk. I coded late into the night while my roommate reminded me that college was supposed to be fun. Yet every all-nighter was a step toward independence. By graduation, I had already built a small app to help students coordinate study groups. My first taste of entrepreneurship. My first company failed, but failure sharpened me. I moved into a cramped apartment with roommates, sleeping on a futon while saving money to try again. A job at Tech Forward, a fast-growing Silicon Valley company, gave me the experience I needed. Within 2 years, I led a team after solving a major security issue. Yet the entrepreneurial fire in me never died. I left that stable job to start Secure Connect, pouring my savings into a vision of artificial intelligence tools for small businesses. The first months were brutal. I gave up my apartment, slept on friends' couches, and ate instant noodles while keeping my small team afloat. When I confided my struggles to my father, his response was that this was the price of choosing an unusual career. Catherine, he reminded me, never had such problems at her bank job. That was the last time I looked to them for comfort. Instead, I leaned on my friends and mentors who saw my potential when my own family did not. The breakthrough came when a venture capital firm invested $2 million. Suddenly, we had an office, a growing team, and a real chance. Over the years, Secure Connect weathered storms, pivoted its focus, and fought competitors. 7 years later, we were valued at over $200 million. When a major conglomerate offered $350 million for acquisition, I finally said yes. My life changed overnight. My first indulgence was a San Francisco condo overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. But the real joy was my Vermont estate, with its sweeping mountains, pond, and forests. I spent $1 million renovating it, turning it into a haven I dreamed of sharing one day. It was meant to be my great reveal at Thanksgiving. I imagined walking my parents through the halls, watching Catherine's smile falter as she realized her little sister had built something extraordinary for once. I would not be the afterthought. But then came that text, just Catherine and her family. No explanation, no apology, only the casual exclusion that had defined my entire life. I had already booked my flight. I could have protested, but instead, I typed one word, enjoy, and decided to pour myself a glass of wine, staring at the city lights of San Francisco. The rejection stung, but this time it would not define me. The afternoon of that text slid by in a haze until my assistant noticed the way I kept staring past my computer screen. I admitted only that it was family trouble, but saying the words out loud loosened something inside me, and by evening a steadier resolve had replaced the sting. On the drive home through a wash of city lights, a thought landed with surprising calm. I did not have to accept the role I had been assigned since childhood. I could choose a different script for the holiday, one that did not orbit anyone's favoritism. I poured a glass of wine on my balcony and began calling the relatives who had always treated me kindly, starting with a cousin who lived on the opposite coast. What I learned turned the private hurt into a clearer picture. My parents had trimmed the guest list down to one branch of the family, repeating polite variations of the same excuse to everyone else. An aunt heard that they were keeping it intimate because of vague health concerns. Though no one was actually ill, an uncle heard they were taking a break from hosting extended relatives after many years. Cousins were told it would be only immediate family, which somehow defined immediate as my sister's household and no one else. The pattern widened with each call. What had felt pointed now looked like a choice that diminished many people at once. Understanding that widened my options. If the door to Michigan had been closed, there was another door I could open. The estate in Vermont could hold more than enough people, with a separate guest house and a luxury inn a short drive away to absorb overflow. The idea brightened as I tested it aloud with those same relatives. Come to Vermont, let me host, bring the kids, plan a weekend instead of an afternoon. Surprise turned to enthusiasm faster than I expected. By midnight, I had a group thread humming with practical questions and delighted reactions to the photos I finally shared of the property: frost-dusted meadows, a pond ringed with birch trees, the great room's stone fireplace scaled for winter gatherings. That thread filled with quick acceptances, ride shares, and offers to contribute desserts. What had been personal rejection became a collective pivot towards something generous and new. At dawn, I called Thomas, the estate manager who runs the property when I am away, and laid out an ambitious plan. He took to it with cheerful precision, booking an additional housekeeping crew, arranging deliveries, and walking me room by room over video while we drafted a plan for seating, sleeping, and flow. We agreed on welcome baskets for each guest, a children's scavenger hunt to keep the little ones entertained, and warm stations throughout the house where people could gather. Cider simmering in the kitchen, blankets by the fire pit, board games in the library, a media room stocked for the post-meal haze. I asked him to secure a chef who could honor tradition while elevating it. Within 24 hours, he proposed a short list, and I chose a caterer whose resume included a Michelin-starred kitchen and a local business built on seasonal Vermont ingredients. Over one long planning call, the chef mapped a menu that balanced comfort and grace. Turkey brined for days and roasted simply, a duet of stuffings, including a wild mushroom version nodding to the nearby woods. Roasted root vegetables with herb oil, a tart cranberry compote brightened with citrus, and my grandmother's sweet potatoes prepared exactly as she taught us. The chef promised to present that dish to her for approval if she came. Logistics became a rhythm I enjoy as much as building products. I booked first-class flights for relatives traveling far and arranged car services from the nearest airport. For those driving, I sent directions that favored scenic routes, marked with roadside farm stands worth a stop. I worked through room assignments like a puzzle, keeping young families near each other, pairing older relatives with the main house's quieter suites, and reserving the guest house for night owls who would likely talk. Past midnight, thoughtful details became a language of hospitality, monogrammed journals for cousins who loved to write, a small selection of local whiskey in welcome baskets for uncles who appreciate a nightcap, coloring kits and wooden puzzles for children. Friends who had held me together during lean years received personal notes and travel upgrades. A former professor who once loaned me seed money replied with a yes that made me smile, promising to bring the same curiosity he had brought to my early business plan. While Thomas orchestrated rentals of heaters for the stone patio and confirmed a local guitarist for an acoustic hour before dinner, I worked with a florist on arrangements that favored branches, gourds, and late autumn flowers in deep oranges and golds. We discussed light as seriously as centerpieces, lamps and candles set to warm rather than glare, dimmers tuned to create the soft evening calm that encourages honest conversation. The dining plan called for 2 long tables so everyone could sit within the same conversation, with name cards I wrote by hand, weaving people who had drifted apart back within reach of each other. I booked a photographer not for staged portraits, but for candid expressions of joy that help memory hold on. By the end of week 1, the thread of acceptances had grown into a tapestry. Friends from the early days of Secure Connect would come. 3 colleagues who had weathered the most uncertain months with me would come. Neighbors from town would stop by for dessert. A few guests asked shyly whether they might bring friends with no plans for the holiday. The house, which had become a sanctuary for me alone, was about to become a sanctuary for many. I felt giddy at the rightness of it, at the way a closed door had cleared the view towards something more generous than the small corner I had been offered. As Thanksgiving approached, I flew to Vermont to walk the property ahead of everyone. A dusting of snow had whitened the fields and roof lines, and the air carried that quiet particular to late November when sound travels farther. Inside, deliveries had arrived, linens crisp, glasses polished. the kitchen humming as the chef's team began their careful work. I moved through the rooms adjusting a pillow, a frame, a lamp angle, not striving for greatness so much as setting the stage for ease. In the library, I found a seat beside the window and pictured the conversations that might settle there. In the great room, I stood in front of the fireplace, imagining the welcome toast and how to ground it in gratitude rather than comparison. I felt nerves, yes, but not the pleading kind I had known for years. This time the nerves were braided with anticipation and a sense of authorship. The holiday would not be something decided for me. It would be something I made. The morning before guests were due, the chef tested pie crusts while stocks simmered. Thomas reviewed arrival windows and weather updates. A rental van dropped off patio heaters, and a local farm delivered crates of vegetables that smelled of cold earth. I walked the trail to the pond in a thick sweater, listening to the faint rush of water under forming ice, and allowed myself to imagine the sound the house would make when filled, footsteps overhead, children's laughter rebounding down hallways, low voices trading stories in corners. For the first time in years, I felt the holiday approaching without the tightness that used to cinch my ribs. It no longer required me to diminish myself to fit someone else's table. It required me to expand in order to set my own. The first cars turned up the drive the next morning just past 10 a.m., tires crunching over a fine sugar of snow. I opened the door to greet an uncle who had fallen out of favor for reasons that seemed small at this distance, and the look on his face as he stepped into the entryway, astonishment giving way to relief, was the welcome I had long hoped to receive myself. More cars followed, and the house began to breathe. Coats rustled, suitcases rolled, voices climbed and braided, and gratitude moved like a current as people discovered rooms prepared with them in mind. Every new arrival added a note to a chord that had been waiting to be struck. By 11:30 a.m., the great room was a tide of reunions and introductions. A cousin I had not seen in years squeezed my hand with a pride that landed deeper than I expected. A college friend teased me about the distance between this home and the futon I used to fold up each morning. Laughter rolled up the staircase and pooled in the mezzanine. I stood for a moment in the center of it and felt something I had rarely felt at family holidays. Belonging that did not depend on permission. By early afternoon, the hum of conversation filled every corner of the house. The chef's team moved with quiet precision in the kitchen, while trays of hors d'oeuvres made their rounds. Children tumbled through the hallway on a scavenger hunt Thomas had organized, shrieking with delight when they discovered hidden treasures tucked into alcoves or behind curtains. The living room fire snapped and popped, the scent of wood smoke mingling with a roasting turkey and fresh herbs. It was everything I had imagined, a holiday alive with connection rather than hierarchy. At 2:00 p.m., I asked everyone to gather in the great room. Standing before the stone fireplace, a glass of champagne trembling only slightly in my hand, I welcomed them. I kept my words simple, focusing on gratitude, on the chance to create new traditions together, on the beauty of choosing each other. I avoided mentioning the exclusion that had driven us here. The toast was met with raised glasses, applause, and laughter that seemed to vibrate through the beams of the old house. It felt like the truest holiday I had ever hosted. Then the front door opened. Thomas, surprised, moved quickly to meet the arrival. When he returned, his voice carried a note of awe. My grandmother had come. Slowly, with her caregiver's support, she crossed the threshold, wrapped in her favorite wool coat. At 87, she still radiated the same grace she always had. But now her eyes carried a mischievous light. She declared she would not have missed her favorite granddaughter's first Thanksgiving as host. The room erupted with affection as she settled into a chair by the fire. For a long moment, I sat beside her, my heart swelling. She had told my parents she was unwell, only to arrange her own transportation here. Sometimes, she said, you must be sneaky to do what matters most. Her presence transformed the gathering. Relatives clustered around her, listening to family stories that had never been shared. Even the cousins well into their 30s sat at her feet like children. She asked after my friends and colleagues as if they had always been part of the family, drawing them into the circle without hesitation. When the dinner bell finally rang at 4 o'clock, we all moved into the dining room together. 2 long tables stretched across the space, lined with candles and autumn flowers. The fine china glowed under the warm light, and handwritten cards marked each seat. Conversation hushed as the chef introduced each course. The turkey had been brined for 3 days, the stuffing enriched with wild mushrooms from nearby forests. The cranberry sauce brightened with citrus. Every dish had been prepared with care, yet the moment that stayed with me came when the sweet potatoes were placed before my grandmother. They had followed her recipe exactly, and her approving smile felt like a benediction over the entire feast. The room filled with voices as we passed dishes, poured wine, and shared stories. There was no kids' table, no separation of groups. Everyone sat as equals, valued and heard. Cousins who had not spoken in years laughed together. An aunt and uncle, long at odds, shared quiet conversation. Friends blended seamlessly with relatives. For once, there was no hierarchy of who mattered most. There was only us, gathered around food and firelight, grateful for the chance to be together. After dinner, the fire pit beckoned. Guests wrapped themselves in blankets as the November chill deepened. Mugs of cider steamed in hands, whiskey glasses glinted in the firelight, and voices rose in song when the guitarist began to play. The photographer drifted quietly among us, capturing laughter, hugs, and the glowing faces of people warmed not just by fire, but by belonging. At one point, my former professor raised his glass in a toast to me, speaking of the determination he had seen in me since Stanford. His words moved me deeply, but what mattered even more was the chorus of cheers that followed, not out of obligation, but genuine pride. Later, we began sharing what we were thankful for. Answers ranged from health to children, from friendship to resilience. When it was my grandmother's turn, she fixed her gaze on me and said she was grateful for brave people who forge their own path when the usual road fails them. Her words filled me with both pride and relief. For the first time, I felt seen fully within my own family. When the night grew late and children dozed on couches, I found a quiet moment with my grandmother by the library window. She told me she was proud not only of the house I had built, but of the life I had shaped on my own terms. She warned me gently that photos and live streams had already found their way to social media. My parents and sister would soon know what they had missed. I nodded, realizing she was right. Hours later, after guests had retreated to their rooms or the nearby inn, I sat alone in the library with a final glass of wine. The house still held the echo of laughter, the warmth of connection lingering in every corner. For the first time in years, a holiday had ended. Not in disappointment, but in contentment. My phone buzzed with a new message. Catherine's words were blunt. "Nice house, Did not know you were so loaded. Mom and Dad are freaking out." I turned off the screen, smiling faintly, and walked upstairs to bed. Whatever tomorrow brought, I had already won something greater than approval. I had found belonging by creating it myself. The morning after Thanksgiving broke crisp and clear. The mountains frosted in sunlight as if the world had been polished overnight. Guests lingered over a breakfast buffet prepared from leftovers reimagined into savory tarts and delicate soups. Laughter floated from the kitchen as cousins compared notes on the best hiking routes nearby, while friends sprawled in the great room planning an afternoon walk. I should have felt only joy, yet my phone buzzed relentlessly on the counter, screen flashing with calls and messages from my parents and sister. 15 missed calls, 27 texts. Their words ranged from confusion to outrage, my mother demanding explanations, my father sounding wounded, Catherine accusing me of showing off. I ignored them for hours, focusing instead on my guests. When Zoe noticed my distraction, she gently urged me to take a moment alone. Retreating to the quiet of the library, I finally scrolled through the flood of messages. The most recent read, "We need to talk. Call immediately." My heart thudded, but something in me had shifted over the course of the holiday. For years I had avoided confrontation, absorbing the small dismissals, the constant favoritism. This time I refused to shrink. I dialed my mother, put the phone on speaker, and began pacing the library's Persian rug. She answered at once, her voice sharp with accusation. Why were there pictures all over social media of me hosting Thanksgiving in a mansion? Why had my grandmother been there? The words rushed like bullets, but I felt strangely steady. I explained plainly I had invited relatives and friends both, after she told me the gathering was only for Catherine's family. I had a home in Vermont, and I wanted to share it. The silence on the line spoke volumes before she muttered about how I should have told them about the house, about how expensive it looked, about where the money had come from. Calmly, I reminded her I had sold my company for $350 million, something I had mentioned the previous Christmas while they were too busy helping Tyler unwrap presents to listen. Her shock was palpable. Then my father's voice replaced hers, gruff and demanding. Was I making a point, taking the family away to Vermont instead of coming home? No, I told him, I was not making a point. I was creating something beautiful out of rejection. Mom had told me I was not welcome. Other relatives had received similar messages. So we gathered here instead. He insisted I had always been treated equally, that the slight was not intentional. I might once have argued, listing years of examples, but I chose a different path. I simply told him our memories differed, and that I was not interested in reopening old wounds. What mattered was that I had built a life and a holiday worth cherishing. Then Catherine's voice cut in, revealing I had been on speakerphone with them all along. Her words dripped with resentment. Why did I have to let everyone post photos, making their Thanksgiving look pathetic in comparison? Why had I invited Grandma, who had told them she was unwell? I answered honestly, I had not posted anything. Our relatives had, because they enjoyed themselves. As for Grandma, she made her own choice. At that moment, the library door opened, and there she was, my grandmother herself, moving with her walker, but radiating purpose. She asked to speak, and I placed the phone near her. What followed felt like a reckoning, decades overdue. She told my parents and Catherine that excluding me and then resenting what I created without them was precisely why she chose to come here. She admitted she had watched me be pushed aside for years, and she confessed her own guilt for not speaking sooner. Her voice, clear and commanding despite her age, cut through every excuse. She declared I had built an extraordinary life and deserved not envy but pride. Silence followed her words, broken only when my father tried weakly to protest that they had always loved us equally. My grandmother corrected him sharply, explaining that love was not just words, but attention, interest, and presence. My mother began to cry, insisting they had supported me too, but Grandma's questions silenced her. When was the last time they had visited me in California, asked after my work in detail, or placed me first even once? The answers were evident in the quiet that followed. Grandma concluded firmly that she would remain in Vermont for the weekend, then return to Michigan to hold a family discussion about what needed to change. She urged them to reflect on their choices, then nodded for me to end the call. When the screen went dark, I felt both lighter and heavier, relieved that someone had finally spoken truth aloud, burdened by the years that truth represented. I turned to thank my grandmother, but she only patted my hand and asked for a good book to enjoy by the fire. That afternoon, I joined a group of cousins on a hike to the pond, crisp leaves crunching underfoot, sunlight breaking through bare branches. The air carried a clarity that matched my own mood. For years, I had shouldered rejection in silence. Now, someone I loved had lifted that weight by naming it openly. Later, as Chef Antoine reimagined leftovers into a feast of soups and pastries, my phone buzzed again. This time the messages were different. Catherine admitted she had always been jealous of my freedom and brilliance, using her favored role as the only arena she could win. She apologized. My father wrote that he was proud of me, words he had never spoken before. My mother's message was quieter, suggesting perhaps they could visit the estate someday. I stared at those texts, unsure whether to trust them, but aware something had shifted. Healing would not come quickly, yet the possibility had been cracked open. The days that followed carried a different kind of rhythm. Snow fell in light flurries across the fields, softening the trails and cloaking the estate in quiet beauty. Guests lingered past the holiday, savoring the chance to spend time together without the tension that usually shadowed our family gatherings. We took long walks along frozen paths, children dragging sticks through the snow, as adults laughed and reminisced. Evenings were spent by the fire, sipping hot cider, watching films in the media room, or telling stories until midnight. My grandmother remained a steady presence, her quiet dignity anchoring the joy that surrounded us. Meanwhile, messages from my parents and Catherine continued. The apologies grew longer, less defensive, as if they were beginning to confront truths they had long avoided. My father admitted he had rarely asked about my work because he did not understand it, but that ignorance was his failing, not mine. My mother confessed she had leaned too heavily on Catherine's nearby presence and confused proximity with love. Catherine, stripped of her old defenses, wrote of the pressure she had felt to remain perfect, fearing that without the role of favorite, she would have nothing left. For the first time, she acknowledged that in clinging to that role, she had helped push me aside. I read their words carefully, feeling both vindicated and wary. Regret typed on a phone was not the same as changed behavior. Still, I could not deny the crack in the old foundation. Something was shifting. I spoke often with my grandmother during those days. Her advice was measured. Awareness is the first step, she reminded me, but commitment is proven over time. Healing would not come from dramatic gestures alone. It would grow slowly, if at all, through consistency and choice. When the last guests departed, leaving the house quiet once more, I walked through the empty rooms, still echoing with their laughter. For the first time in my adult life, a holiday had ended not in exclusion, but in connection. I returned to San Francisco with a sense of peace, but also with a question: what would come next? December arrived with its rush of work obligations, year-end reports, and investor meetings. Yet my thoughts often drifted to Vermont and the possibility of facing Christmas differently. I could have chosen to spend it with friends in California or traveled abroad, but a small part of me considered the risk of opening my doors to my parents and sister. Could I allow them into the sanctuary I had created, even after years of being ignored and dismissed? I resisted the idea at first, unwilling to invite back the very people who had wounded me most. It was my grandmother who shifted my perspective. Over a phone call one evening, her voice carrying both wisdom and warmth, she urged me to see that healing often begins in small, imperfect steps. I did not owe my family forgiveness, she reminded me, but I could choose whether to create space for something different to grow. Perhaps it would fail, but perhaps it would take root. After days of reflection, I composed a careful email. I invited my parents and Catherine, not Brad or the children this time, just our original family unit, to spend Christmas in Vermont. I wrote honestly, this was not about erasing the past, but about creating the possibility of something new. Their response came quickly. They accepted, with questions about flights, weather, and what to pack. I arranged everything as I had for Thanksgiving, from first-class tickets to a car service, ensuring that their visit would carry no logistical burden. On December 23rd, I stood in the entryway of my home, watching as their car wound up the long drive. My chest tightened with a mix of dread and hope. My mother stepped inside first, eyes widening at the grandeur. My father followed, uncharacteristically quiet, while Catherine trailed behind, her expression caught between awe and something that might have been regret. I welcomed them simply and offered a tour. As we walked through the rooms, their silence deepened into something else, recognition, perhaps, of the life they had never bothered to ask about. My father paused at framed magazine covers in my office, reading aloud headlines that named me a visionary. He asked quietly why I had never told them about these achievements, and I answered with a truth he could not deny. I had tried, but their attention had always been elsewhere. He nodded, shame flickering across his face. My mother lingered in the library, tracing spines of books she never knew I loved. Catherine ran her hand along the leather of a sofa, her gaze lingering on details that spoke to years of effort she had never witnessed. By the time I showed them their rooms, each prepared with thoughtful touches, something had shifted. Dinner that evening began stiffly, but wine and warmth gradually loosened tongues. My mother asked questions about my work that sounded genuine. My father shared stories from his career, hoping to draw parallels. Catherine spoke with an honesty I had never heard, admitting that my brilliance had frightened her from the start, that she had feared being overshadowed, and so clung to being the favorite with all her might. My mother admitted her role in feeding that imbalance, praising one child too much while neglecting the other. The words hurt, but they also healed. It was not a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning. Later we sat by the fire, laughter breaking through the heaviness, the glow of the tree softening the sharp edges of our shared history. For the first time in decades, I felt the possibility of a family bond that was not defined by comparison. The days leading to Christmas unfolded more gently than I expected. Snow piled high on the roof lines, softening the estate into something that looked like a holiday card. My parents and Catherine adjusted slowly to being in my world, a place they had never entered before. We walked the wooded trails bundled in coats, the crunch of snow underfoot, filling the silence when words failed. Evenings brought board games before the fire, classic films in the media room, and long talks that were sometimes awkward but often surprisingly warm. One afternoon, I sat with my father in the library. He ran his hand along the spines of my books before stopping at a shelf lined with finance and investment texts. For the first time, he spoke to me not as if I were still the lost daughter, but as an equal, offering thoughts on strategy, asking about my future plans. The conversation felt like a bridge I had been waiting decades to cross. My mother, meanwhile, joined me in wrapping gifts for staff and neighbors, pausing often to remark at the care I had put into everything. I could see the dawning realization in her eyes that the daughter she had underestimated had built not just a company, but a life filled with thoughtfulness and independence. Christmas morning carried a different energy than any I remembered from childhood. We gathered around the soaring tree, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The gifts exchanged told their own story. Gone were the generic sweaters and bath sets that once signaled indifference. Instead, my parents had chosen books by authors they knew I loved, artwork that complemented my home, gestures that showed they were finally paying attention. Catherine's gift was a painting of the San Francisco skyline, a piece that acknowledged my world beyond Michigan. For my part, I had chosen rare financial history volumes for my father, a spa retreat for my mother, and a portrait session plus a weekend away for Catherine and Brad, promising to care for their children myself. We laughed as ribbons flew and paper piled high, but the undercurrent was something quieter, a recognition of effort, a willingness to see each other anew. At dinner that evening, my mother raised her glass, her voice trembling as she toasted new beginnings and called me her remarkable daughter. Tears filled my eyes at words I had waited my entire life to hear. My father hugged me with uncharacteristic emotion, telling me he was proud of the life I had created. Catherine, perhaps for the first time, looked at me not with rivalry but with something closer to respect. Still, the path was not without tension. Old habits tugged at the edges of our conversations. My mother sometimes slipped into comparing Catherine's children to milestones in my life. My father occasionally retreated into silence when the discussion grew too vulnerable. But there was awareness now, a consciousness of those patterns, and a tentative effort to shift them. Even Catherine admitted during a late-night talk that she had resented me, not because I was lesser, but because deep down she knew I might be greater in ways she could never match. Speaking the truth aloud stripped it of some of its power. When their visit ended 2 days after Christmas, the goodbyes felt more genuine than any in recent memory. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering thanks for giving them another chance. My father looked around the estate once more before telling me. Quietly, he wished he had listened more closely years ago. Catherine lingered at the doorway, her eyes holding a mixture of apology and hope. I did not know what the future held, but I sensed the possibility of something different, even fragile, had been born here. After their departure, I walked alone through the quiet rooms, the scent of pine still heavy in the air, the lights of the tree glowing softly in the corner. I thought of how this journey had begun with a single painful text that threatened to reduce me once more to the role of the forgotten daughter. Yet it had led here, to a holiday filled with honesty, recognition, and the first steps toward healing. As the new year approached, messages from extended relatives poured in, asking if the Vermont gathering might become a tradition. Their enthusiasm confirmed what I already felt, that the space I had created was worth nurturing, a place where people could come together without favoritism or exclusion. I resolved that future holidays would carry the same spirit of inclusion, whether or not my parents or sister chose to join. Standing on the back porch on New Year's Eve, I watched the final sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. A peace settled over me, deeper than any I had known in years. Belonging, I realized, was not something granted by others. It was something I had the power to create, to shape from the ashes of rejection into the warmth of connection. Have you ever had to create your own sense of belonging when you felt excluded by family or friends? Share your story in the comments below. I would love to hear it. And if this journey resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue exploring stories of resilience and renewal together.